Alrighty, lads, it has been a long time, but I figured let's come back strong and let's talk about the very thing that I love the most about Warhammer. Warhammer Fantasy, War of Vengeance, the battle tactics. So I did talk in earlier videos about specific battles like Corvineth, but I haven't covered Tor Alessi yet, and there's a reason for that. Tor Alessi has like 13 sieges on it. Those sieges need to be broken up, and I need to do a good 40 or hour long video talking about what happened in those sieges. But for right now, we're going to kind of skip ahead and talk about what were the average battle tactics we would see in the War of Vengeance as it played out. So throughout the entire war, that's what you're going to find out. What were the elves doing? What were the dwarves doing? And a few other minor factions. What were they doing during this time period? So besides that, sit back, relax, enjoy the lore. So, as I said, this is going to take place right after the failed siege of Tor Alessi. The short version is, as the dwarves were sieging Tor Alessi, they understood that the entire army of Ulthuan was coming to Tor Alessi to reinforce it, along with dragons, specifically 6 of them, and their leader, Imladric, would take over command. This was a death sentence for the entire dwarf army because they didn't have their runesmiths, they didn't have a lot of their full army at their disposal. They had 100, I'm not joking, 100 grudge throwers and bolt throwers, but they didn't have really enough to deal with everything. Because mind you, what's riding those dragons are mages, and those mages are going to cause a lot of havoc along with the dragons themselves. Sure, you got the bolt throwers, that's great, but the mages on top of the entire army of the elves behind it, it's a no deal. So the dwarves backed off. As the dwarves were marching in their column formation, the dragons did try to do as much damage as they possibly could. They destroyed a lot of the equipment that the dwarves had to leave behind, and they also rained fire on some of the dwarven columns, incinerating many of their warriors. This would be more or less the battle tactics the elves are going to go for. And Imladric, the leader of all the elves by this point in the New World, he told all the elven lords who have been in command, who have barely been holding on to their own cities they have made in this world, he tells them all at the Grand Council, their action is to not fight. This pissed off a lot of the elves. A lot of the elven commanders were like, what? We have the entire army of Ulthuan at our back. We have dragons. We have powerful mages here, finally. The dwarves destroyed Corvineth, and they almost destroyed Tor Alessi. And you're saying, don't attack them? Don't burn them out of the mountains? Don't make those squealing piggies run out of their holds, flaming to their beards? Why? Why would we not do that? There was a few reasons why. The main reason was that Imladric, he actually liked the dwarves. He learned their language. He loves the dwarves in a lot of ways. And Imladric knew that this war was not for the right reasons for both sides. Imladric tried his best to broker peace, and the only way to broker peace with the dwarves would be not to incur that many grudges with them. If they just went eye for eye, tooth for tooth, the dwarves will never back off. The dwarves won't even begin to talk to you. And this is something that a lot of the elven lords didn't understand. They figured, hey, let's just treat them like we treat everyone else. Give them the carrot and give them the stick. I'm going to beat them and beat them and beat them until they beg for a carrot. Then I'm going to beat them with the carrot too. This, of course, did not settle with Imladric, and he said, no. If you do that, you will do it all by yourself. I don't even want your troops helping you. They did not like that. Now, the dwarves on the other side, they really didn't like their High King, because, mind you, his son undermined him, Snorri, Half-Hand. Mind you, Snorri was not the king. He wasn't even a king. He was the son of the High King. People love Snorri. He took out the very wrath of the dwarves onto the High Elves directly. He was a dwarf's dwarf. Everyone loved him and could rally behind him. Now that he's dead, they now have their High King to rely upon for guidance, for leadership. And what did he do? He mostly sat on his ass, did not want to go to war with the elves, And then when he finally goes to war with the elves and joins the main forces against Tor Alessi, what does he do? He simply tells them to retreat. A lot of people do not like the High King at this point. So the battle tactics of the War of Vengeance devolved into essentially every king of every hold waging their own war and grudge against the elves on their own volition. The High Elves returned the favor. The High Elves went about their own business where individual lords of individual settlements would wage their own wars. Now, whenever one of the elven settlements would be besieged, the dwarves would kind of be grounded into the standstill with the elves. Some of the settlements they could get away with, and they could destroy and ransack the elven cities as quickly as they could. 10,000 dwarves march in real quick, kill a bunch of elves, and retreat. Some of the time, though, they couldn't do it, and the reason why is because 2 or 3 dragons would show up and shoo them away. This would be rinse and repeat for the rest of the war for quite a long time, and some new things developed. This is really cool of the dwarves. The dwarves, they utilized the concept of the elves. The elves rely on their hearing, on their sight. The elves are very masterful of their senses. So the dwarves used what they were good at. They were very masterful at deadening anything that they touch. They deaden the winds of magic. They deaden their own senses. They deaden the senses of their enemies. So this is what they did. They would dig out massive trenches through the continent. Trenches. Not holds, not under tunnels, no. Trenches. And then they would have rangers and dwarf quarrelers stand guard in those trenches for days, months on end. These would be dwarves who were sitting so still and so immovable that they would be undetectable even to the greatest of elven rangers. Even the dark elves couldn't tell that there were dwarves sitting there. And then, at a last moment's notice, all of a sudden you'd hear the gears turning in someone's crossbow as it comes thwacking at you. Thwack, boom. That's an elf dead. Boom, another elf dead. And the elves would realize onto this tactic pretty quickly, and they realized that the best way for them to treat this was to just charge into the tunnel as quickly as they could. Most of the dwarven army would be kind of caught off guard by elves ramming into their line, but at the same time, this is a trench. This isn't a shield wall. So when it's a trench and everyone's got their crossbows out, and here comes an elf with a giant sword swinging away willy-nilly into the line, he's going to get a few bodies. And that's really the only method that the elves had to protect themselves, or at least salvage a victory in these kind of circumstances. They couldn't develop a way to detect the trenches because the dwarves were so still. The dwarves were so innate, so inanimate, that they could bygone all senses. So the elves had to take a risk where once the dwarves attacked, they knew where the trench was. And from there, they just had to get in there and just try to butcher as many dwarves as they could. This was a really unique situation because here it is, the elves relied on bows and arrows and spears. The dwarves relied on shield and axe, hammer and armor. But here the two races had to develop new strategies. The elves had to, for once, utilize long swords. And here the dwarves had to utilize crossbows and light armor, or chainmail at best. This was a totally different playing field for both sides, and we see it. The dwarves are of course taking casualties because they're not used to fighting with so little protection, so little armor, and they're not used to fighting an enemy with no shield in their hands. The elves, on the other hand, are not used to getting so close and personal to their enemies, and we see this a lot with the dwarves, is that sometimes the dwarves are so innumerable compared to the elves, mind you, this is their home, that the elves get almost demoralized. They don't want to continue fighting. They lose hope. Whereas dwarves, you can have them surrounded, they're still going to spit at your shoes and say, "Is that all you got, you thag and elgi?" Something else that was very interesting is that the dwarves had developed new marching stances. You see, it used to be the dwarves would just march the way that they would always march in a nice big column. But because of the threat of dragons just swooping in and incinerating the entire column, like a long streep or long swipe of one's buttocks when you're wiping your ass, the dwarves developed this new tactic of hiding ballistas inside their formations when they march. Now, they would face these ballistas in different directions. This is more or less to counteract the idea of a dragon coming in from behind or in the front or from the side. It makes it very unique. We're talking like 2 or 3 bolt throwers together, and you'll have one that's way in the front and it's facing backwards. And you may have another 2 or 3 bolt throwers in the middle and they're facing forwards. And you have like 2 or 3 in the back and they're both facing forwards as well. This is the kind of formation you would see. And there was a few dragons who did succumb to these vile contraptions, these new battle tactics, where the dwarves would again assemble en masse, and a few dwarf kings from a few dwarf holds would get together and just smile and snicker to each other and go, "The Elgi won't expect this. Yeah, those Elgi, they think their dragons are going to stop the 3 of us from destroying their city. Let's see them." And the dwarves would actually bait the elves into releasing their dragons just to kill them. This was really the main goal of the dwarves, was eliminating the support the elves had. So, since they couldn't take Toralessi, a lot of the battle tactics of the dwarves was simple. Each king would assemble or cooperate with each other to assemble their own armies, and focus primarily on disrupting supply lines with their trenches, and then also destroying the minor settlements of the elves, and trying their best to bait out the dragons. If they can bait out and kill a dragon, just a single one, that was a victory worth 1,000 dwarves. It didn't matter how many dwarves died, it was well worth the price. And this is what the dwarves focused on. The elves, on the other hand, we see a much, much different tactic. The elves, on the other hand, focused more and more and more on their arrows. They focused on their arrows for their cities. When it came to the whole city defense, they realized that their city defenses were adequate. Spear wall, arrows, 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 arrows. That's what was wiping out the dwarves. But when it came to outside their cities, they had to develop very different battle tactics. They had to develop tactics that involved speed, melee, and wiping out as many dwarves as they possibly could before they break through. This was really the main goal of a lot of the elves, was to outrun or outpace the dwarves. The only problem is that they don't know how much the dwarves have, I would say, coordinated. Like, if you're fighting a trench, you don't know if this is the middle of the trench or if you're at one of the ends of the trench. You don't know how far you have to go to get out of that trench war zone. This was a lot of the issues for the elves. And mind you, they didn't really want to change their battle tactics either. They figured, as long as we held Toralessi, the dwarves will never win. They were kind of right, but they were kind of wrong. The dwarves would win, it would just take them a long time, and they would have to bleed out the elves quite a significant bit, which they, of course, did. And a lot of the elves realized that the best way they could survive is not by engaging the dwarves at all, much like Imladric said, but instead to skirmish with the dwarves by hiding in the trees. And those very trees and those very elves who were in those trees later developed into the Azrae. That would be the Wood Elves. And their battle tactics were very interesting, where they would divide themselves in groups no bigger than 50, and they would be in groups of maybe like 4 or 5 elves per group. So that way, should a dwarf encounter that group, they will use their bows and their arrows and their knives to kill as many dwarves as they can, and hopefully retreat. If they can retreat, they can relay to the other elves where they are and where all the dwarven armies are. This way, all the other elves can kind of converge around the area and just give stray shots. 1, 2, 1, 2. As many arrows as they could score. The dwarves, on the other hand, they had no real counter to this. They had their crossbows, they had their quarrelers, but the only way they could deal with elves hiding in the trees was to just keep pursuing relentlessly. This was led by one Steelbeard who just could not let a grudge go, and he pursued them into Athelorn, deep, deep, deep into their forest until he finally met his end. This was really the only battle tactic that could work against the dwarves, was draw them out, let them chase you, and just keep scoring them with arrows. Problem was is that the high elves as a whole did not want to use this battle strategy. They don't want to use this strategy because they believe that it shows weakness. They believe that the only way that they could win the war was by showing their true superiority and sticking their boot onto the dwarves' face like the true pigs that they were in their eyes. Of course, Imladric and the Wood Elves later realized that that was a dumb decision. They should have really just stuck with their arrows, but they didn't. They wanted to prove a point. And in this has been the end of the video. That's the battle tactics. Let me know what you guys think down below. It's kind of lengthier than I thought, but besides that, I enjoyed it. I hope you guys did too. And overall, we will be covering the Siege of Toralessi at some fucking point whenever I get through this whole nursing school shabako. So, besides that, see you guys next time.